my husband told everyone I was crazy. For a year. Friends, family, everyone. So when I finally found the truth, I didn't say a word. I waited. And played his voice at dinner. Nothing dramatic. My closest friend was having her birthday gathering the kind I'd been part of every year for a decade, and this year, somehow, I just wasn't asked. When I brought it up, lightly, trying not to sound hurt, she went quiet and a little strange, and she said, "Oh, I just figured. With everything you're going through, you probably wouldn't be up for it." And I remember standing there in my kitchen thinking one confused thought. What is everything I'm going through? Because as far as I knew, I was fine. My life was ordinary. Nothing was wrong. That was the first small piece of ice showing above the surface. It would be months before I understood how much was underneath it, and that my own husband had quietly built every bit of it. This is the story of how I went from being the paranoid one that everyone gently worried about, to playing a 90-second recording at a dinner table that made an entire room understand, in real time, exactly who the unwell person in my marriage actually was. Before I tell you, I want to ask you something, and I genuinely want your answer in the comments. Has someone ever quietly turned the people around you against you, drop by drop? With a worried voice and a sad little headshake, until you started to wonder if maybe you were the problem? Be honest, because that is the loneliest thing that has ever happened to me, and for a long time I didn't even know it was happening. Tell me in the comments if you felt it. I read every single one. And before the story goes on, I want to say one thing directly to anyone in that fog right now, because I needed to hear it and no one said it to me. If you feel like the people you love have started handling you like you're made of glass, and you can't find the moment you became fragile, you are allowed to trust your own memory of who you are. You don't have to prove your own sanity to keep it. Just notice, quietly, and keep noticing. And don't let anyone rush you out of your own perceptions. That noticing is not paranoia. Sometimes it's the only part of you that's still telling the truth. Let me tell you who I was before the ice. My name is not important. What matters is that I was, by every account including my own, a calm and steady person. My husband's name is Chris, and Chris was the charming one, funny, warm, the guy everyone wanted at the party. I was the quieter one, the one who remembered everyone's birthdays and listened more than I talked. For 8 years, that balance worked. People liked Chris instantly. People trusted me slowly. Remember that difference: instant charm versus slow trust, because Chris would eventually turn it into a weapon. I should tell you that the marriage hadn't felt like it was failing. That's important, because it's part of how the trick worked. Right up until the ice started showing, Chris was, if anything, more attentive than usual. He brought me flowers. He told our friends, in front of me, how lucky he was. I've since learned that's a pattern, the affection that runs ahead of the betrayal. The kindness that's really a down payment on a future alibi. At the time, it just felt like love. So when the strange little signs began, I had no framework for them at all, because the man supposedly so worried about my fragile mental state was, at home, treating me like a queen. It is very hard to suspect a campaign is being run against you by the person who just warmed up your tea and tucked a blanket over your feet. That contrast wasn't an accident either. It was camouflage. The second piece of ice came a few weeks after the birthday. My sister, who I talked to about everything, started feeling distant on the phone. Careful, and one day she said gently, "I just want you to know I'm here if things get overwhelming. Chris told me you've been having a really hard time." And again, that confusion, that small cold drop. What hard time? I asked her what he'd said. She got vague. Just that you've been stressed, anxious, a little, you know. He's worried about you. And she said it so kindly, so full of love, that arguing with it would have sounded exactly like the thing she'd been prepared to expect. I drove home from that conversation with my sister in a fog I couldn't name. Because here's what it does to you when it's done well. It doesn't feel like an attack, so you can't fight it. There's no villain in the room, no insult to push back against. There's just a slowly thickening atmosphere of concern, and the more you try to say, "But I'm fine," the more you sound like exactly the person who isn't. I actually remember getting home that night and looking at myself in the bathroom mirror for a long time, genuinely asking myself, am I okay? Am I missing something everyone else can see? That is the moment the trap is designed to produce, the moment the target starts doing the work of doubting herself. So the architect doesn't even have to. I stood in that bathroom and handed myself the very doubt Chris had spent months planting. That's how good it was. That's the genius of it, and I didn't see it yet. He wasn't telling people I was a monster. He was telling them he was worried about me. There's no defense against worry. If you get upset about being called unstable, you look unstable. If you stay calm, well, that's just you hiding how bad it really is. He had built a story with no exit, and he'd handed copies of it to everyone I loved, with a sad face and a caring voice. And I was the last person in my own life to find out I was its main character. The pieces kept surfacing over the next couple of months. A friend who texted less. A cousin who looked at me with soft, pitying eyes at a family thing and asked if I was sleeping okay. An invitation that didn't come. And the strangest part, the part that nearly broke me before I understood it, was that it started to work on me. I began to feel anxious, because everyone was treating me like I was anxious. I began to second-guess myself, because everyone seemed to be quietly bracing for me to fall apart. I started wondering if maybe I was losing it. That is what this kind of thing does. It doesn't just convince other people you're unwell. It slowly convinces you. I want to be honest about how dark that period got, because I think someone watching needs to hear it. There were nights I lay awake running an inventory of myself. Had I been irrational? Had I overreacted to something? Building a case against myself out of perfectly normal human moments, because everyone around me seemed to already believe the verdict. I started apologizing more. I started shrinking. I caught myself prefacing ordinary opinions with, "I know this might sound paranoid." And I didn't even notice I'd started doing it, because Chris had so carefully made that word, paranoid, the air I was breathing. If you have ever found yourself apologizing for your own perceptions, narrowing yourself to fit a story someone else seems to have about you, please hear me. That is not always something wrong with you. Sometimes it is something being done to you. I could not tell the difference for months. The phone call is what finally told me. If your chest tightened just now, if you know that exact feeling of slowly being made into a story you didn't write, do me one quick favor before I tell you the moment it all turned. Tap like and subscribe to the channel. I'm not asking for nothing. These calm, slow burn revenge stories get buried by the algorithm unless people actually engage. And your one tap is the only reason the next one reaches a woman who is sitting alone tonight, wondering if she's the problem when she isn't. And believe me, the moment the ice cracked open is the part you need to hear. It cracked on an ordinary Wednesday, with a phone call I was never supposed to receive. My phone rang, and it was Chris. I almost didn't answer, because he was supposedly out at a work dinner. But I picked up and he didn't say hello. Because Chris hadn't meant to call me at all. His phone had called me from his pocket. A butt dial. The most ordinary accident in the world. And for the next 90 seconds, before it cut off, I listened to my husband, who did not know his phone was broadcasting to me, having a conversation with someone else. It was a woman. Her name, I'd learn, was Alexis. And they were not talking about work. They were laughing, that warm, easy, intimate laugh I hadn't heard from him in years. And then I heard Chris say something I have never been able to unhear. He said, "No, it's fine. She won't figure it out." And honestly, even if she does, I've spent the last year telling everyone she's paranoid and falling apart. So if she starts making accusations, it just proves my point. Nobody's going to believe a word she says. Nobody's going to believe a word she says. I sat down on the kitchen floor. Not because I was falling apart, but because, for the first time in months, the floor was finally solid. Because in 90 accidental seconds, every single piece of ice I'd been confused by snapped together into one enormous, clear shape beneath the surface. The birthday I wasn't invited to. My sister's careful voice. The pitying eyes. The anxiety I'd started to feel. None of it was me losing my mind. All of it was a campaign. My husband wasn't just having an affair. He had spent a year, methodically, with a sad face and a caring tone, building me a reputation as an unstable, paranoid woman, so that when he finally left, he'd be the patient hero who'd endured so much, and I'd be the crazy wife nobody could quite trust. The affair was the easy part. The masterpiece was making sure that if I ever told the truth, it would sound like a symptom. I need you to understand the cold brilliance of it, because once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. Most cheaters are afraid of one thing above all, getting caught. So they spend their energy hiding. Chris had done something smarter and so much colder. He hadn't bet on never being caught. He'd built a world in which getting caught wouldn't matter, because by the time I found anything, I'd already be established, in every important mind around me, as the unreliable narrator of my own life. He hadn't hidden the affair so much as he'd insured it. He'd taken out a policy against the truth, and the premium he'd been paying, for a year, was a steady drip of worried little sentences about his poor, struggling wife. When I finally understood that, sitting on my kitchen floor, the fear left me completely. Because a plan that elaborate has one weakness, and it's the same weakness every time. It only survives in the dark. And I was holding a light. And here is the thing he did not know. Sitting in that restaurant laughing with Alexis. The butt dial had gone to my voicemail. The whole 90 seconds. It recorded. I had it. His voice, his words, his plan, in his own mouth, saved on my phone. So I did the single most important thing I did in this entire story. Nothing. I told no one. I made no accusation. Because I finally understood the trap completely, the second I started making accusations. I would be doing exactly what he'd told everyone I would do. The smear was a net, and thrashing would only tangle me. So I went very, very still. I saved the recording in 3 places. And then I did something that probably sounds strange. I let him keep believing it was working. I kept being the quiet wife. I let him think the paranoid. Fragile woman had noticed nothing because a man who thinks his plan is working keeps talking. And a woman the world thinks is unstable has one enormous secret advantage. Nobody watches the person they've already decided is harmless. That became my quiet superpower for the next few weeks, and I want to name it for anyone who might need it someday. Because it is counterintuitive and it is true, being underestimated is a form of freedom. Everyone around me had been told to expect very little of me except instability. So when I was calm, no one read it as strategy, they read it as me having a good day. When I asked gentle questions, no one heard an investigation, they heard a fragile woman reaching out. The very story Chris had built to cage me turned out to be the perfect cover to move underneath. He had spent a year lowering everyone's expectations of me to the floor. He never once considered that the floor is exactly where you stand when you're about to lift something heavy. So while Chris relaxed, I got to work quietly. Carefully. The way you have to when the whole board has been turned against you. First, I needed to understand the scope, without tipping him off. So I started having quiet, ordinary one-on-one conversations, coffee with my sister, a phone call with the friend who'd gone distant. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't say Chris is lying about me. I just gently asked questions and listened, and let people tell me, bit by bit, what they'd been told. And a map emerged. For about a year, Chris had been dropping his sad little worries into every ear that mattered to me. To my sister, I was anxious and not coping. To our friends, I was struggling, getting irrational, maybe a little paranoid. He'd even, I learned, told a couple of people he was scared things were getting worse. He had been so patient, so consistent, so kind about it. It was the cruelest thing I have ever encountered, and it was delivered entirely in the language of concern. The scope of it, once I mapped it, took my breath away. It wasn't one or two careless comments. It was a campaign with a cast. There was the version for my family anxious, not coping, he's so worried. There was the version for our couple friends a little irrational lately. You know how she gets. There was even a version I discovered for his own coworkers, who I'd later learn had been hearing for months about the saintly husband holding a difficult marriage together. He had tailored the story to each audience, the way a good liar always does, so that no two people compared notes and found a seam. And every single version had the same load-bearing word in it somewhere. Paranoid. He'd planted that one word in a dozen minds like a seed, so that the day I came running with the truth, it would already be waiting there to greet me. Oh, the paranoia. Just like he said. Second, I went to see a lawyer, because I had stopped being naive about what kind of man I was actually dealing with. I brought the recording, and she told me 3 things I haven't forgotten. The first, I had done exactly the right thing by not confronting him and not broadcasting accusations. A smear campaign like this, she said, only works if the target reacts the way the story predicts. You haven't. You've stayed calm and you've documented. That makes you the most dangerous person in this situation, and he has no idea. The second, she walked me through how to handle the recording properly and lawfully, that because of how it had come to me, accidentally, and how I intended to use it, I was on solid ground. And she would help me make sure every step stayed clean. The point was never to break a rule. The point was that, for once, I had the truth in his own voice, and the truth doesn't need to shout. And the third thing she said, quietly, she said, he spent a year making sure no one would believe your words. So don't fight him with your words. Let him hear his own. She told me something else in that office that I've carried ever since. She said that the reason these campaigns work is that the target almost always responds emotionally, and emotion, to an audience that's been pre-warned, reads as proof. He has trained everyone to interpret your feelings as symptoms, she said. So the most powerful thing you can do is feel nothing they can see. Be the calmest person in the room. Let the evidence carry the emotion for you. It was the same lesson I'd been stumbling toward on my kitchen floor, said plainly by a professional, and it reorganized me. I stopped thinking of my calm as something I was barely holding on to, and started thinking of it as the weapon it actually was. The angrier I had every right to be, the quieter I decided to become. That sentence became my entire plan. Because here is what I understood. I could not undo a year of whispering by whispering back. If I went to each person and said, actually, he's the liar, it would just be my word against the careful story he'd planted, exactly the fight he'd designed for me to lose. But the recording wasn't my word. It was his. And there was one place where I could let everyone hear it at the same time, with no chance for him to spin it first. A dinner. Chris loved a gathering. He was, after all, the charming one. So when I suggested we host a dinner, a nice one, with my sister, our closest friends, a few of the people whose ears he'd poured his story into, he was delighted. It fit his narrative perfectly. See, she's doing better, we're entertaining, what a supportive husband I am. He had no idea he was helping me set the table for the only courtroom I needed. I planned that dinner the way Chris had planned his campaign, patiently, and with attention to every detail, except I did it in days instead of a year. Because I finally had what he never counted on me having. proof, and a clear head at the same time. I thought about who needed to be in the room. Not strangers, the specific people whose belief he had stolen. My sister, the friend whose birthday I'd missed, a cousin, a couple whose pitying looks I could still feel. These were the jurors he'd selected for me. And I was simply going to call court into session at my own table, with his own voice as the only witness. I even thought about the seating, so that when the recording played, I could see every face. I wanted to watch the spell break. After a year of being watched and pitied, I had earned the right to watch back. In the days before, I did the quiet, boring, essential things. I made sure my own finances were protected and separated. My lawyer prepared what needed preparing, so that the dinner would be the beginning of my exit and not just a scene. I made copies of the recording, and I planned the evening down to the minute, because I was only going to get one. There was one bad moment, 2 days before, when Chris almost found it. He picked up my phone to check something casually, the way spouses do, and my heart stopped, because the recording was right there. But I had renamed the file something boring, something invisible. A voice memo labeled like a grocery reminder. He scrolled right past his own confession looking for a pizza place. That was the closest it came. After that, I kept it somewhere he'd never think to look, the same place he'd never thought I'd be looking, one step ahead. The night of the dinner, the house was warm and full. Chris was magnificent, funny, generous, refilling glasses, holding court. At one point, with a little affectionate sigh, he even told the table how things had been tough, but we were getting through it. And laid his hand over mine, and everyone gave me that soft, worried, pitying look I had come to know so well. The look he had manufactured. I just smiled. And then, when the moment was right after dinner, when everyone was settled and quiet and listening, I said I wanted to share something. I said it had been a strange year, and that I knew some of the people in this room had been worried about me, and that I wanted them to hear something that would help them understand what had really been going on. And I pressed play. For 90 seconds, the room listened to Chris's own voice. The laugh. Alexis. And then the line. I've spent the last year telling everyone she's paranoid and falling apart. So, if she starts making accusations, it just proves my point. Nobody's going to believe a word she says. I did not say anything over it. I didn't need to. I just watched the faces around my table change, watched a year of careful whispering dissolve in 90 seconds of his own voice, watched my sister's hand come up to her mouth, watched the pitying looks turn, one by one, toward the man at the head of the table who had gone the color of the tablecloth. I didn't accuse him. I never said the word liar. I let him, exactly as my lawyer had said, hear his own words in front of every person he'd said them about me to. When it ended, the silence was the loudest thing I have ever heard. I have been in quiet rooms before. I have never been in one like that. It was the silence of a dozen people simultaneously rewriting the last year of their own memories, every worried conversation, every pitying glance, every poor thing, all of it flipping over at once to show what had really been printed on the back. My sister was crying before the recording even finished. The friend whose birthday I'd missed had her hand pressed flat against her chest. And Chris just sat there as the warmth drained out of the room he had always so easily owned, watching the single most valuable thing he possessed, other people's belief in him, evaporate in his own voice. Chris opened his mouth, and for the first time in 8 years, the charming one had nothing. There is no charming way to follow a recording of yourself explaining how you planned to make your wife look insane. I stood up, calmly, and I thanked everyone for coming, and I said I thought it was time for Chris to find somewhere else to stay. And my sister, who had spent months gently bracing for me to fall apart, stood up with me, and so did my friend. And the story he'd spent a year building was simply gone. replaced by the only thing stronger than a whisper campaign, which is the truth in the liar's own voice. The divorce was clean, because I'd prepared it before anyone heard a thing. But the part that actually healed me wasn't the divorce. It was the next morning, when my sister called me crying, apologizing for every careful, worried conversation, telling me she should have known, she should have asked me directly. And one by one, the people he'd poisoned came back not with pity now, but with something far better: belief. Chris, stripped of the narrative that made him the hero, turned out to be just a man who'd been lying to everyone. And people have a way of remembering that about a person. Alexis did not stick around for the version of Chris that everyone could finally see. I want to tell you what the months after actually felt like, because the recording was the loud part, but the healing was the quiet part, and the quiet part is what mattered. For a long time after, I kept catching myself in the old habits, the reflexive apology, the urge to soften my own opinions, the little flinch before I said what I actually thought. A year of being told you're unstable doesn't wash off in one dinner. I went to a therapist of my own choosing, and slowly I stopped bracing for a verdict that wasn't coming anymore. The friends came back. Genuinely, my sister and I are closer now than we have ever been. Because nothing bonds two people like one of them realizing she almost lost the other to a lie. And the version of me that existed before Chris started editing her the calm, steady, trusted woman she came back to. It turned out she'd never actually left. She'd just been talked over for a while. And if you'll let me leave you with one thing, not as someone who got revenge, but as someone who was nearly convinced she was losing her own mind by the person who promised to love her, it's this: if the people around you slowly start treating you like you're fragile, or unstable, or not coping, and you can't understand why, pause and ask yourself a quiet question. Who benefits if everyone believes that about me? Sometimes the answer is no one, and you really do need support, and that's okay. But sometimes the answer is one specific person, and the moment you see their hand in it, the spell breaks. Trust the version of yourself you knew before someone started editing it. The people who truly love you will never build their comfort on quietly convincing the world you're crazy. Only the ones with something to hide ever do. There's one more thing, though. A few weeks after Chris moved out, one of the friends he'd confided in the most came to me with a message Chris had sent him over a year ago, at the very beginning, that revealed the real reason Chris had started the whole campaign in the first place. It was not what I expected. What that message said, and what I did once I understood the true beginning of all of it, is a story entirely its own, and it might just be the most satisfying one yet. It's right there on your screen. You are going to want to see how that one ends.